much. It's really such an honor to be here. When Cornwall reached out with the invitation to come speak, I was really overjoyed, and I'll share with you a couple of reasons in particular why this is such a personal opportunity for me. Somewhere buried down in my bio, excuse me, is the fact that my first job out of college was as a high school English teacher at Dickinson High School in Jersey City, New Jersey, and I feel like I grew up professionally. My heart and my mind educationally was formed with my kids at Dickinson, which I'm sure many of you have certainly driven by, probably on a very regular basis, and probably perhaps been to. And I subsequently spent a couple of years coaching teachers, high school English teachers in the Newark system. So I've spent a lot of time at the Old Central and at Shabazz and at Weequahic and other schools in Newark. And I believe that Jersey City and Newark will always have my heart, and I believe they are among the most interesting and important cities in our country. And so I'm grateful to maybe pay back a little bit of what I owe to those two great cities today. Also, I was deputy chancellor in the New York City system years later, and was greatly blessed to spend a lot of time working on high school work in New York City during that time. And also, I'm coming to you today from New Jersey. I live in New Orleans with my wife and kids, but my wife and I were having a child this summer. And you may have noticed the hurricanes and the virus, hard as the virus has been in communities in New Jersey, New Orleans, we've experienced the same thing. And plus we have the double threat of having a horrible summer, the worst summer on record from a hurricane perspective. In fact, my neighborhood is underwater as we speak, not Katrina-like waters, but water nevertheless. So we came up to New Jersey to have our kid, and so I'm coming to you from Morris County today, and I am now the proud recent father of a native New Jerseyan. So I have many reasons for being having a lot of debt to repay to New Jersey and Newark in particular. I will tell you though that the reason I'm here is because what I did and what my team did and what our state did and its kids did in the 9 years that I was the state superintendent of education in New Jersey. In Louisiana. I'll just tell you just off the top, what did we accomplish and why am I here? And then I want to tell you a little bit of the story of how I got there and how we got to where we got. And I'm hoping that in sharing that story, there will be a couple of lessons that could be useful as you think about doing what I think is one of the most courageous and important things that you could do. And what's crazy about it is it's a pretty simple thing. And that is simply saying that when you graduate high school, whether it's in Newark or whether it's in New Orleans or anywhere else, if you must have a plan and it must be funded as to what you do next. In other words, that diploma has to mean something. It has to lead to something. And part of that is making sure that whatever you do next, it's paid for and that you're getting all of the aid and the assistance in furthering your education and opportunities you can possibly get. And that shouldn't be an opt-in system. That should be a basic fundamental tenet of our education system, that when you move on, you apply to the next step, and that's what a diploma implies, and financial aid is a big part of that. So what we established and what we accomplished was a policy that said that every young person, if you are to graduate from a high school in the state of Louisiana, will complete the financial aid application process. And that in doing that, we went from being the bottom of the pack to being the top of the pack. As Michael mentioned, we led the nation in my final years as superintendent in the percentage of seniors that completed a FAFSA. But more than that, and more important from my perspective, studies of this policy have shown in the years since that we literally closed the gap in terms of FAFSA rate completion between the wealthiest schools in the state and the poorest schools in the state. And it won't surprise you to know that in the Deep South, the poorest schools in the state are almost entirely African-American. They bear the scars of generations and centuries of enslavement, of bigotry, of bias, of prejudice, of segregation. And that I viewed this from the time that we conceived of it as a policy, as being a policy that was about justice and was about civil rights. And we have to think of it in those terms because the financial aid policies of our state and of the country conspire against low-income students of color. And so we have to think about making the opportunity to apply for federal aid as a matter of civil rights and as a matter of opportunity, not just as a matter of student achievement. And I want to talk a little bit about how that works and why it works and why this was so particularly profound, because it's not just about a number on a page or a statistic. It's actually about assuring a right that has long been denied. So how did we get to that point? Well, I became early on as a high school teacher at Dickinson interested in why Dickinson's a school of 3,100 kids. It's one of the biggest high schools in New Jersey. In fact, I think by the time I completed, only Elizabeth High School was a bigger high school than Dickinson. And I would go to graduation every year, and we did it in the gym. You know, there's a building at Dickinson that's kind of the gym that overlooks 1 and 9 as it comes off the turnpike. That's the gym, the building where the gym and the pool is, and we'd have graduation there every year. And everybody would clap and everybody was so happy and the families were there, not unlike any other high school in the country. But there was no discussion of what happened to kids when they left. And of course, as any parent knows or any high school teacher knows, you get over the years these kinds of dispatches from kids who graduated. Some of them, you know, fantastic. I mean, I've got kids who grew up in poverty in the projects across the street from Dickinson. I've got kids who are first generation immigrants, who are tremendous success stories. They are accountants and artists, and most of them are still in New Jersey or in the tri-state area, and I keep in touch with them. And then I've got kids I never heard of in the day after they graduated, never heard from, haven't been able to find. And that's not a story that is probably new to anybody on this call, but they all got the same diploma. And what struck me is that for as passionate as we all were about getting them across that finish line, for the most part, the school and the school community assumed that those kids were passed off into someone else's hands. And that always troubled me, you know, that we really didn't have much of an idea of what was happening to such a huge percentage of the kids who walked across that stage every June in Jersey City, repeated in thousands and thousands of high schools across the country. So when I got to the state level, I started asking questions, you know, because the state is the one that graduates the kids. I was my signature on all these diplomas, literally every year, 50,000 diplomas, my signature. And I started asking, well, what do we know about where these kids end up? And the good news is that more than when I was teaching in the 90s, we do have more of an idea now. And the same is true in the state of New Jersey. You know, we have more of an idea now. There is a system that helps us to track where every young person who goes to college ends up, whether it's a 2-year school or a 4-year school, whether it's in-state, whether it's out-of-state, you can track where all those kids end up, and that's great. But in a state like Louisiana, only half the kids go to a 2- or 4-year institution. Only half the graduates go to a 2- or 4-year institution. Most of them, or half of them, don't. And so I asked, well, where do those kids go? And the answer is, well, we don't know. And I said, well, how can that be? I mean, what is their future? And so I started digging into the employment numbers, assuming that, well, maybe they show up in the rosters of various employers. Maybe they're paying income taxes, so they've got to show up there. And it turns out that, not surprising probably to anyone on this call, youth unemployment or unemployment among 18 to 24-year-olds, even who have a high school diploma, is incredibly high. They're disengaged from the workforce at a dramatic rate. And I wanted to understand, well, what is it that happens to young people 18 to 24 who aren't going to 4-year institutions and who, surprisingly, aren't showing up on the rosters of various employers, and they appear to be largely disengaged? And of course, not surprising to probably anyone on this meeting, the answer is they weren't getting educated, they weren't experiencing professional training, and they were largely either unemployed or they were taking on what I would call low-level minimum wage, entry-level dead-end jobs. And that is a problem. And so then you kind of have to dig into, well, how could that be? I mean, how could it be with all of the career and technical education programs, all of the job training programs the federal government spends on in cities like New Orleans or Baton Rouge or Jersey City or Newark? How could it be? How could it be with all the community college outreach programs, all those things? How could it not be that there isn't a continuing education option, even for young people who aren't immediately going into a 2-year or a 4-year academic program? And what I began to uncover as my team and I worked through this issue is that the system of high schools, and by the way, I place no blame on high school counselors for this at all. You know, the average high school counselor at Dickinson High School had 400 or 500 kids. They had 10 different jobs to do, and none of this is their fault. But the truth of it is that their job was largely to get the college applications and the scholarship applications across the finish line for all the kids who had college scholarships coming up. And that the system deprioritizes the kids who are not conventionally college bound. I say not conventionally college bound. They may end up in college someday. They may go to a career and technical education program. They may go to a non-traditional training program, but they're not, in the way that the high school system defines it, that college bound kid. They're not the kid who's going to Rutgers. They're not the kid who's going to NJIT. They're not the kid who's going to NJCU. And so the system defines them as not college bound. But then I had all these people telling me, in today's economy, unless your future is really just in fast food, or in New Orleans, for example, bussing tables, washing dishes, doing other jobs in our tourism industry, you have to go to some form of post-secondary education and training. That's not a choice. And so all the reports were saying, look, it doesn't mean you need to go to Rutgers and get a degree in sociology or political science or what have you, but you do need further education and training in order to get a leg up in the economy. And yet it was only the kids who were going to Rutgers or Southern or Grambling or LSU or whatever it was that our system seemed to be concerned with. So we started asking, well, how would a kid who wanted further education, but it wasn't a four-year degree, what would it be? And how would they pay for it? And it turns out that actually federal aid, or even some forms of state aid in Louisiana, would pay for you to go get the training experience you need to become an entry-level computer programmer, to become a medical technician, a phlebotomist, a surge tech, a pharma tech, to become a welder or a pipe fitter or an electrician. Actually, good entry-level work necessitates some form of community college or other training experience that very often, more often than not, was covered by financial aid. The problem is nobody was ever talking to that kid about financial aid. And I thought back to all those kids at Dickinson, many of whom have kind of fallen out of my life. And I wondered, had anyone just had a conversation with them about filling out a FAFSA and about what opportunities there were for them that maybe didn't involve a first step into a four-year program, but could involve a first step into a training organization or a community college? And the answer, as I talked with more counselors and teachers and parents and kids in Louisiana, was that my suspicions about what I saw at Dickinson were confirmed, and that the reality was nobody was ever having a conversation with that kid. They were an afterthought. And while everybody was so focused on the diploma, nobody was ever focused on what would happen the day after the diploma. And that felt to me like a real problem, especially because when you dig into the data in the Deep South, and in New Jersey too, I suspect, but in the Deep South, those kids were overwhelmingly Black, and they were overwhelmingly poor. And they overwhelmingly lived either in inner cities or in the furthest reaches of rural communities along the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta. They were the poorest, most disadvantaged kids in our state, and nobody was ever talking to them about it. So let's take it a layer deeper. So why is that? I mean, it's not that the counselors or the teachers or the parents or the principals or everybody doesn't have compassion, doesn't have a moral heart. It's not like in the Deep South, they're not aware of civil rights as an omnipresent concern. So why is it? And when you dig into it, the reason is that the state financial aid system in Louisiana is a merit-based system. And it says if you get a 20 on the ACT, which let's say roughly is equivalent to 1,000 on the SAT. If you get a 20 on the SAT and you got a 2.5 GPA, the state of Louisiana will pay every dollar of tuition and fees that the federal government doesn't pay. But if you don't qualify for that, if you don't have a 20 on the ACT, you don't get that scholarship. And the way you get that scholarship, if you qualify, is by submitting a FAFSA. So the kids that the counselors were approaching first about submitting a FAFSA were the kids who had that 20 or higher, that had that 2.5 or higher. And they were never talking to the kids who didn't have those credentials because they didn't qualify for state aid. They were never talking to them about the FAFSA. So let's just get this straight. What that means is that the way you get state aid is by submitting a FAFSA. And it's the kids who were getting the state aid who were submitting the FAFSA. But first and foremost, the FAFSA qualifies you for federal aid. So the kids who weren't getting state aid, who are still eligible for financial aid, for federal financial aid, were never getting a conversation about the federal financial aid form because they didn't qualify for the merit-based state aid system, which is a complicated way of saying that kids who are 1 point below on their ACT or 1 point below on their GPA never got a conversation about filling out forms that are actually more essential for them because they're the ones who need the federal aid more than everybody else who already got the state aid. The kids who need federal financial aid most, even if they're not going to Rutgers to do the 4-year sociology program, they needed to do the 2-year program. They needed to do the training organization. They needed to do the industry credentialing program. They needed to do the apprenticeship. We're never having a conversation. So we start talking about, well, you know, that's crazy. In a state that has seen the greatest violations of human rights in American history, that we literally have an education policy that is conspiring against tens of thousands of young people of color and otherwise, but principally young people of color, submitting a federal financial aid form that assures their right to future education. That is crazy, and it's terrible, and it needed to stop. And so we started testing with people. Well, how could we make it stop? And the good news is everybody was fired up about this. At that point, 44% annually of Louisiana's high school seniors were completing. We started throwing out statistics. Louisiana is leaving $250 million in federal aid on the table every year. We started putting in the newspapers. I started getting calls. People started getting troubled by it. Nobody quite yet knew what we could do about it, but I started taking that statistic, $250 million a year around the state, talking about it, asking people, how can we solve it? People had good ideas. High school said we could do events. The higher ed system said we could get involved. We could put our counselors against the problem. Even the accountants, HR Block said when we sit down with people to help them fill out their taxes, and the CBOs that do that said, why don't we just bring the FAFSA with us? And so everybody was willing to put all hands on deck. And so they started, getting into gear. We started making small grants, for example, to community-based organizations, to high schools themselves to hold these events. It only takes a couple $100 for a high school to have the money to pay the security and keep the lights on at night. We would do that. We'd make grants to them to hold events. And we started seeing the numbers tick upwards. But still, the hardest to serve kids were left out of the process. And so finally, my team and I were just kind of sitting around one day and we said, hey, wait a minute. What if rather than the FAFSA being an opt-in system, a system where you got to get all your information together and say, I'm willing to do this. Instead, we say, it becomes the norm. And if you don't want to do it, it's an opt-out. Meaning the way you graduate from high school in Louisiana henceforth wouldn't just be completing your courses, passing your end of course tests. It would also be filing a FAFSA. It would be the norm rather than the opt-in exception to the norm. Now, when we started talking to people about this, people said, no, it'll never work. Louisiana is a conservative state. People don't like mandates. People don't like government intrusions. There's going to be all sorts of privacy things. And as people gave us that feedback, there were some legitimately important issues. I'll give you an example. Undocumented students. Of course, them not being eligible, whether you agree with that or not, them not being eligible for this aid and them having a lot of reason to not want to put forward their information and their parents' information, that made a lot of sense as a concern that we needed to be very sensitive to. Some parents, for different reasons, not always reasons I understand, are concerned about submitting any more information to the federal government. Some parents just happen to have the money and they'll never qualify for financial aid, and they said, we just don't want to go through it. So there were issues legitimate and not legitimate for why parents would say, we don't want to participate in this process. But our hypothesis was always that, one, we could find ways of accommodating them. And two, that was a very marginal set of people relative to the massive number of Louisianans who had been denied this opportunity over the years. And remember, I'm not just talking about denying the FAFSA, denying even a conversation about the FAFSA or about what comes next in life or about a financial aid form. So we went forward with this and we created a policy that didn't just say you have to submit the FAFSA. It said you have to submit the FAFSA or your parent has to sign a letter opting out, and to just give a brief reason for why. And we always said, we will take the parent at his or her word, or the guardian at his or her word, that their hardship, their rationale, their reason is good enough for us. So to Michael's point, we didn't have 100% of students completing a FAFSA. We had undocumented students. We had ideologically opposed parents who submitted a letter to us saying we would prefer not to submit it. But the public school numbers in Louisiana went from under 45% to 90%. And our overall state rate, when you factor in private school students, went to 80%, leading the nation. We vaulted to lead the nation in the very year that we implemented that policy. And there are two important things to note about it, and then I'm really interested to turn this conversation over and start a larger dialogue with this group. First, we still maintained making all those little grants to all those community-based organizations, to all those tax preparers, to all those high schools holding events. And so one of the coolest parts of my job as state superintendent is I go around the state, big cities like New Orleans and Baton Rouge, small rural communities, and I'd go to their FAFSA nights. Every high school in the state had a FAFSA night. And you'd see parents just streaming in, and counselors from the higher ed system, from the K-12 system, from the community colleges, walking around helping them on these laptop stations that these high schools had set up, fill out their FAFSAs. It was the coolest, most inspiring thing. I'm talking about from the rural Mississippi Delta to the bayous and the swamps of South Louisiana to downtown 9th Ward, 7th Ward, New Orleans. Second, this was always not about just driving up the number. It was about closing the opportunity gap. And so the New Century Foundation recently released a study, the first really in-depth study of the effects of this. And what, as I said at the top of this, what they basically showed is that the gap between the FAFSA completion rate in the wealthiest middle-class schools in Louisiana and the poorest schools, and remember, this is the poorest schools in the second poorest state in America, was entirely closed by this policy. And you know what's interesting? In an era of political divisiveness, and frankly, in an issue, and I think Newark knows this quite well, New Orleans knows this quite well, education reform is a divisive and difficult issue in communities. We had one day of political strife on this issue. A bunch of folks who just have a beef with President Obama and have a beef with the federal government, have a beef with Common Core, have a beef with Obamacare, they showed up in our state legislature and they wanted to kill this policy. And a Republican-led committee united with civil rights Democrats, and they killed that motion right off the bat, and we never heard of it again. Because the people of Louisiana know that this policy is delivering value and delivering on a promise too long deferred. And that's why Little Louisiana's policy created and led to a piece of legislation passed across its neighbor to the west, 5 times its size, the state of Louisiana. It's why the state of Illinois, which is not an easy place to get anything done politically, was the 3rd state to adopt the policy. It's why the largest state in the country, in the state of California, is considering the same policy and actively has a bill on the floor of its legislature considering the policy. And it's why I'm very proud to say that my professional home, the state of New Jersey, is considering this. And that's why I'm also so proud that a city, not just a state legislature, but a city itself is considering, with no external legal mandate, not the federal government, the state government making it do it, but the city of Newark is having a conversation about this issue. And I'm so proud to have played a part in it. And that's why I'm so proud to be here having a discussion about it. I'm not here to pretend like everything is good and well in Louisiana. Louisiana still has deep, deep issues of inequality. And just getting kids a funded college education doesn't solve the concerns about college completion. It doesn't resolve issues of economic opportunity post-college completion. And partially that's why a colleague of mine have started an organization that's getting its New Jersey-based start in Camden. It's getting its Louisiana-based start in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, called Propel America. That's not just about getting to college, it's about getting to college and getting a job, because there are still obviously legions of barriers to low-income young people of color really achieving the full promise of a college degree. But this is a good start. And it's a barrier that can be taken down. It's a common sense policy that can do right immediately by tens of thousands of kids in a state like New Jersey and thousands of kids in a city like Newark. So I'm very grateful to have had the chance to come talk about it. I'm really looking forward, Michael, to the dialogue. And more than anything, I'm just grateful to be able to share a little bit of what I've learned, good and bad, with the people of a place that I care deeply about. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. It was a really wonderful presentation. So I want to open it up to the group for questions. Again, unmute your mic and feel free to offer a question.
Hi, this is Kalina Berryman. I'm the director of the Abbott Leadership Institute. Thank you, Mr. White, for that presentation. Yes, in Newark and in the Rutgers-Newark community specifically, we have been talking a lot about the mandating of the FAFSA, and I know there's some legislation about it. However, in our city, when the idea was introduced, it was very much met with community dissatisfaction. Not necessarily that they were against the idea of mandating the FAFSA, but it was the process. So I wanted to know, what was the process from having that meeting, deciding that this should become a mandate, to actually implementing it? Was it something that was immediately done, or was there time given to building community education, awareness, investment, buy-in? And then secondly, we know that it had tremendous impact on completion of the document, but FAFSA is still a document. So how did it change student motivations for college? How did it change students, the culture around college readiness in schools? Like, what was the impact that this mandate had on young people and families seeing college as more of a possibility for their lives?
Yeah. Well, those are both wonderful questions. And I don't have wholly satisfactory answers to either, but I'll give you my version of it. On the first question, it was not an immediate thing. This was a 5-year process. You know, my belief is that policy is best done when you have the time to frame the problem and and actually kick the problem around in communities. And you're not talking about solutions, you're talking about problems. Because it is not an immediately evident thing to everybody why, who doesn't wake up every day thinking about education policy, why a kid who isn't on the surface motivated to go to college or have the scores to go to college, why it is still the case that a post-secondary education is an essential opportunity for them, at least a choice for them to have. It's also not an obvious thing that, let's say your passion and your interest really is, for example, to be a carpenter or to be a technician in a hospital or in a home health environment. It's not an obvious thing to many people that does necessitate a college education, because it's probably not going to be at Rutgers Newark. It could well be at a community college or in a training organization, but federal aid, and in some cases state aid, pays for those things. So it's a hard case to make. Like, you actually have to get out and talk about that. And that's why I said that the $250 million we leave on the table was a compelling way of bringing people to the table, is let's talk about why this is. Because then when you really dug into it, you could say, these are kids for whom the Pell Grant program or others was created. It wasn't created. The FAFSA wasn't created to be a vehicle for qualifying people for merit-based aid. It was created to provide an avenue to the middle class for low-income people who otherwise wouldn't have it. And yet the structure in Louisiana was denying those very kids the opportunity to complete it. When you really worked through that history, people were like, oh yeah, got it. And then they'd raise the objections. And as I said, I think about half the objections were totally legitimate. So we didn't end up with a FAFSA mandate. We ended up with a mandate that you engage in the financial aid planning process and you consider whether to move forward or whether to opt out. And all we did is just shift the moving forward to being the norm and the opting out to being the exception. Whereas today in low income communities, moving forward is the exception and just not doing it is the norm. And that's a critical shift. The policy should never be you're mandated to do the FAFSA. The policy should be you have a couple of options. You do the FAFSA or you sign us a letter letting us know you're not going to do the FAFSA. We don't care. It's your call. but one's going to be the norm and one's going to be the exception. And that's where we ended up. So we never were in a position of having to defend a mandate. We were in a position of having to say, look, if you're going to give you that sheet of paper saying you graduated from high school, shouldn't it be just the norm that you actually consider, you apply to move on to something that's funded as a next step? And if you don't want to do it, that's fine. That's not our judgment to make, but you're going to do it affirmatively. You're going to make a decision. You're not just going to have nobody ever talk about it. And that was the shift that we made. That was all because of a process where we were able to hear very legitimate grievances. And I think there are very legitimate and age-old concerns about government intrusion, about too much process, about top-down things that touch both historically excluded communities and that touch people who are ideologically opposed to government intrusion. And we had, in our state, we had a blend of both. Anyway, long story there, and you can talk about what you think is legitimate and not legitimate, but it was there, and you have to acknowledge it. Secondly, so we have seen significant uptake in college enrollments in the pre-pandemic years after we implemented this policy. And while we haven't done the surveying to really discern the extent to which that policy is specifically causal, the uptick is so significant that you have to assume there's a relationship there. Now, that all being said, I think the pandemic is going to throw, as anybody here who's involved in social science would know, it's throwing all sorts of research into a state of chaos. My own, for example, in curriculum has been thrown into a total state of chaos. So I don't know that I can draw that as tight a linkage post-pandemic. But I would say this: I am more concerned today than I was a year ago about the drift of high school graduates whose parents are not in a position to pay the tuition and take them and drop them off at the dorm in the fall. That's the kid we should be most concerned about. And in this all discussion about pods and online learning, no one is talking about class of 20, class of 21, who is assuring a bridge to post-secondary life for that young person. I don't know why that's not an issue. If I were a governor, mayor, superintendent, that and reading for young kids are the two things I would be shouting from the rooftops right now about. Yeah. But it's those kids are not, the capital P politics base, and they're not getting talked about. So in a way, it's not relaxing the FAFSA policy that I'd be most focused on if I were state superintendent or governor right now. I'd be focused on making damn sure we're implementing that policy and making sure that every kid has a lifeline in spite of the pandemic disruption. So all of which is to say, whether you think its effect is enduring in terms of college persistence or not, and that's a very legitimate critique of the policy. It doesn't have much to say about college completion. I actually think as a bulwark to a serious gap in connectivity that high school students have right now, it's actually a policy that's doubly important than what it was.
Thank you for answering our questions, and congratulations on your new baby.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, John. You kind of touched on this in your presentation, but can you speak to some of the unanticipated challenges, as well as some unanticipated, strengths in terms of kind of launching this campaign? What were some things that you didn't anticipate, as well as some, benefits that transpired that you going into it didn't anticipate?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one thing that I wasn't anticipating was local district superintendents and school boards really getting excited about it. And I talked a little bit about the community dimension to it. I think this is, I think it's hard for schools to find ways of delivering value to kids. And I think when they realized that, when they stopped thinking about this as another administrative burden, and they started thinking of it as an opportunity to bring parents in and sit down with them and talk about something new with them, something they hadn't talked with parents about. And they got past the idea that parents wouldn't want to come in, because I think that was something, a lot of our parents are single parents, they're working 3 jobs. It is a demand to ask them to come in. A lot of parents though were saying that I met, this was an open invitation and we took it. Somebody to sit down and help us complete this form that is admittedly too daunting and too complicated and shouldn't be that way, was a welcome thing. I wasn't really anticipating that. I was anticipating a lot more sort of reticence to invite parents in and go through all the trouble and so on. I didn't sense that. I sensed this was a reason to have community meetings, basically. So that was positive. What I have been surprised by on the negative front is in particular in rural communities where I think, and in the most desperately poor rural communities, and in Louisiana, that tends to be hugging the river from the north, which is the Arkansas-Mississippi border, down to the south, which is the mouth of the Mississippi River. In a lot of those communities, there was still a little bit of, why us? You know, this doesn't touch us. This is, our kids don't go to places like Grambling or LSU or whatever it is. And we were still getting, and still are getting, a fair number of opt-out requests that were parent signed, but I'd be lying if I told you I thought those were genuine parent signatures. I think those were parents who largely were told that this is not for their kid. And so in those very tragic cases, I think the school was sort of saying, hey, look, this isn't for your kid. If you could just sign this, it'll be all good. Don't put your kid through this. Don't put yourself through that. So I think some of you have asked questions about culture. I think that college going culture, when you put this policy in, it goes gangbusters. If it doesn't exist in any form, the school can still sort of depress the excitement and the impulse, and can, you know, motivate parents to not participate. That's the negative side of not having a mandate. So what did we do in response to that? We realized that actually we had to have a whole school reform strategy focused on those schools. So we've started to use our Title I school improvement monies, which, as you know, states get those resources, and we basically put a FAFSA completion model grant out to those schools using those dollars. And we just intensively focused on about 50 schools, mainly in rural communities across the state. And we started to see improvement on the measure because of that very focused strategy. But that was an unfortunate and not anticipated byproduct of the process.
Thank you for that.
And you know, in terms of the high school graduation rates question, so this is Nora asked this question. You know, I should have mentioned this. I mean, one of the fears anytime you put a high school graduation requirement into the system is the system's going to say, hey, wait a minute, you're asking me to raise up high school graduation rates, and at the same time, you're putting another requirement on us. How do those things sync up? Because isn't it the case that if a kid doesn't complete, then you know, you're not going to graduate them? And of course, the answer is that's right. If a kid didn't complete, we wouldn't graduate them. But the reality is, if you manage it well enough, you inform every district every week, this is how many kids, and this is which kids are on track to graduate, but haven't completed their FAFSA. And then you start showing week after week, you can show all the districts. This is the top district, and this is the bottom district. You can get them on a conference call or webinar, and you show all of them. This is who's really killing it. This is who's struggling. And then they can develop a competitive urge themselves. By the way, we did all this. We were in intense competitive battle with Tennessee to be the national leader. And then we spurred Nevada to have a competition with New Mexico. So there's a positive kind of competitive dimension to this that you can instill in schools, within districts, in districts against districts, and in states against states to make this really fun. And that spirit of competition, friendly competition, kind of spurred a lot of gains in this, such that we never ended up denying a kid a graduation or diploma because they didn't complete the financial aid form. And that was a critical thing when Texas and Illinois came calling, because their superintendents were wondering the same thing. The truth of it is, any kid who's going to graduate isn't going to let that FAFSA stop them. You just need to make sure the schools and the school systems have accurate information. And you can work with the federal government to get accurate information as to who's completed and who hasn't, manage it to the last day, make sure no kid pays the price, and every kid gets across the finish line.
So Nora, I didn't know if you had anything else, and so feel free to unmute and ask. And then next, I know Van Deen had a question.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, John. I also wanted to know if you saw any marked differences at the school level in terms of teacher administrative engagement. You know, I think if one of the goals of educators is to successfully get students through school and then to some sort of post-secondary path which can lead to their success, right? Did you see greater levels of kind of teacher efficacy or engagement that came with this that also then simultaneously helped continue this push and grow the policy?
Not in any academic or researchable sense. No, we haven't done any qualitative research on it. I mean, I can give you anecdotally that I think schools became proud, and that's another thing states can do, by the way, or districts can do with schools, is award. So a school gets 100% FAFSA completion, we would send them a banner. We would, and it became this thing. So I cannot emphasize enough how much school reform has come across as punitive when the power of those of us in government or policy or philanthropy is actually much more to honor the creativity and the ambition and the compassion of the best of us than it is to punish and regulate the struggling or the stragglers. And I just a little bit of praise goes so far. And so I guess what I would tell you is I saw schools come together as along the lines of a collective identity as a 100% FAFSA school, in particular in low-income communities. I mean, look, I live in New Orleans, with densely packed city. We've got schools every block or every 5 blocks. You drive around, schools have these banners on them. We got 100% FAFSA and that kind of thing. And that's a very cool thing to see. So I don't know that I could speak specifically to the sort of the long-term emphasis on those issues within schools, but I know I can speak to the kind of positivity that's generated. The one thing I would say that I think holds us really back from what you're describing, Nora, is that the accountability systems at their essence still reward high school measures of success rather than post-secondary measures of success. Meaning you can't criticize a high school or a high school principal for exclusively focusing on a high school diploma when your whole school rating system is predicated on a high school diploma, high school courses, or high school tests. So I do think that a critical advance going forward will be for states and districts to begin to make more information available to principals, teachers, and parents about what are the long-term outcomes of young people, and to really stimulate a discussion about how can one school that has a 95% graduation rate have a 50% college completion and an 80% employment rate after 5 years, whereas another school with a 95% graduation rate has a 10% college completion and a 50% employment rate after 5 years. And states have those data ready to be made available to localities, but they're not organized enough, they're not well run enough for the most part to really figure out how to package them and make them relevant in those local contexts. And I think we'll never get a college-going, post-secondary job attainment culture within our high schools, really, until we make that information matter in local communities and school communities.
Yep. Vandine, I think you had a question.
Yes, John, I was just wondering if you had any formal role in supporting states or districts looking to implement this policy. I know you mentioned your new organization tackling other inequities, but I wanted to know if FAFSA completion was one of them.
Yeah, I saw your message. The answer probably is I should. I don't really. I'm the founder of an organization of progressive district and state education leaders called Chiefs for Change. Chiefs for Change kind of picked up the mantle of this policy and has run a number of competitions and tried to support it at the state level. At the district level, though, it's not really providing a ton of support. But as I read your note, I realized we probably should, and so I will think about that. But that nonprofit that I used to chair was the vehicle by which we did it. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that the top states in the country for FAFSA completion are Chiefs for Change states. We were all kind of in an internal competition with one another, and then you throw DC in that mix too. The state chief in DC and the district chief in DC are both members of ours. So that was the vehicle by which I tried to make this a national thing. What I wasn't anticipating is just how many states got wind of it and would pick up the phone and call us. So I informally I'm supporting and kind of advising the folks in Texas, for example, on their policy, folks in other states across the country that are trying to mimic it as well.
Oh, and next, Betsy, I think you had a question.
Yes, I was wondering if undocumented students are eligible for state aid in Louisiana.
No, because the state aid in Louisiana is a last mile. It's the last dollar aid. So it comes on top of the federal aid. So it necessitates that you have participated to some extent at least in the process of the federal aid system, which effectively discounts undocumented students from participating in the state aid system. I maybe, as my comments alluded to, find that greatly unfortunate, personally, but that is their reality of it.
And do you know if there's any support on the state level or the community level in Louisiana to extend aid to undocumented students in any way?
I would say that the political climate in Louisiana is deeply biased against immigrants, and in particular undocumented immigrants, in a way that I wouldn't think would lead to it. That being said, sad as I am about the divisiveness in politics, at Dickinson, we had a large number of undocumented kids who lived in the Heights and the Journal Square part of Jersey City, and watching those kids go off to university. I mean, many of them very, very successful with no support whatsoever to become aspiring professionals. Many of them have become professionals. Is just couldn't be worse. So no is the answer to your question. Not in Louisiana. I hope elsewhere this will become a more, as the DACA kind of discussion evolves, and hopefully we'll get an administration that will be more supportive of dreamers, then we will be more sensitive to the needs of the country and undocumented children.
Thank you.
I mean, just to put this on the table again, it is ludicrous, given the incredible opportunity we have to fund the educations of those young people against the relatively small percentage of the population that they make up, that we're not making an investment in them. But we are the society that we are right now, unfortunately.
So John, what's interesting is when I was looking at your bio too, it speaks to increasing the number of, percentage or number of students in advanced placement courses. So do you see that as being connected to some of the work you all were doing with the FAFSA, or kind of another campaign? I know you were really interested in creating a college-going culture. And next, Ron, I'll give you a chance to speak. I apologize for interrupting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think it's worth noting that if you don't have high quality programs in high schools and colleges, all of this is sort of moot, which is that, this is just a platform for funding and for getting people engaged in post-secondary education. I think there are two pieces of this that are really important and are just really, really hard. First is 8 years from freshman year of high school to senior year of college, especially knowing that most four-year experiences take longer now than 4 years. That is just too long. It's just too long. And I'll be honest, I mean, I've taught high school seniors. I think the high school senior year is a formative experience developmentally, but let's be real. I mean, academically, you can't point to that many high schools that are making fantastic use of the senior year of high school. So in my view, we should overlap as much of the high school experience with the collegiate experience as we possibly can without sacrificing rigor. And in fact, I would argue that doing so will prompt questions about rigor of the high school curriculum. I was a high school English teacher. I started the advanced placement English Lit program at Dickinson. And I did it because I was tired of seeing kids in my classes engaged in really rigorous study of literature and getting no credit for it when they'd go to college, albeit these are many kids who are desperately poor and we're going to have a hard time paying for college. It makes no sense that we don't have a more overlapped undergraduate and high school experience from my perspective. AP was one vehicle for doing that. I like AP because it maintains a rigorous standard, whereas I find dual enrollment programs are sometimes more subject to the sort of whims of different faculty members or high school teachers. But the principle stands. We should be overlapping the two. Second is, I really do believe that we should be revitalizing the career and technical programs. I mean, I think there is rightly a deep suspicion and concern along the lines of civil rights with our CTEs. I think it'd be totally fair to say that especially in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the programs that in many ways were the backbone of working communities in this country became backwaters for dumping grounds for kids who were thought of as lesser than. And a lot of us have a recollection of that, and we're suspicious of career and technical education. However, it is still the case that in this nation, 30% of American adults have a four-year degree. 70% do not. And in a world where so many high-quality jobs, and I'm thinking about places to work like Barnabas, for example, where you can go get a job as a medical assistant, as a phlebotomist, as a licensed practical nurse, all the way up to an RN. But you can start your career with a real toehold in the economy in a way that doesn't require a college degree. We need to have faster paths, not just into four-year institutions, but into two-year institutions and industry credentialing programs that are of quality. And the point about the FAFSA is, if you have that sort of high school programming, you're sending kids into adulthood with momentum. The FAFSA just continues that momentum. It doesn't create the high quality programming. The high quality programming has to be alongside the FAFSA, and I would argue early college and career and technical education programs of quality that lead to good jobs, not making birdhouses, as I've seen in some districts in Louisiana, but good jobs. That's a corollary to what it is that we're talking about here today with the FAFSA.
Yep. And so next we have Ron, and after Ron we have Charity.
Yeah. So I'm actually really intrigued by any work that's happened post kind of setting up these options, right? Where kids and families are doing this as the opt-out, not the opt-in. Just because so much work around creating possibility with kids and families happens with the conversations from middle school and high school, right? It's not suddenly happening at the end of junior year or the beginning of freshman year. And so to the extent that middle school teachers and early high school teachers are talking about multiple options that are open, and that the pathway to these options are through acquiring state aid, and that's through the FAFSA place, like, is there anything happening now that's come after the work that you've done in order to kind of create a more rich environment and discussion early on?
Yeah, that is such a great question. I think it is school by school. And this is why I said, to one of the questions earlier, why I think the power of communicating data related to post-secondary outcomes back to the school is so important. What I like about this policy is as I like, by the way, the insistence on I should have said this at the outset, we require an industry-based credential or the completion of the curriculum that qualifies you for the state scholarship system in order to graduate from high school. So that you can do both, but you have to at least do one, which is in order to graduate from high school, which is to achieve a high quality industry credential approved by our state's Department of Labor, or you have to complete the curriculum that allows you admission to a four-year institution. And so I think that the more standards or norms related to post-secondary expectation the state or the district can set, it creates a bully pulpit for state leaders, district leaders, school leaders, and community leaders to say, this is the new norm. And I think off of that norm, you can drive down culture change within schools, but the schools have to do it. That's not a function of the bureaucracy. That culture change is a school level issue. It's just a prompt to an awareness at the school level. And look, take New Orleans. I mean, I think New Orleans, which you probably have heard of and studied, a lot of incredible things have happened there. One of the things that's happened there is a kind of insistence on a university-bound culture for low-income New Orleanians. And at the same time, I think that was partially done to the exclusion of kids who either weren't interested in, weren't able to, had disabilities that prevented them from participating. For example, mild, moderate developmental disabilities that may have not had them participating in the conventional university curriculum. I think those kids were not thought of, included in that post-secondary vision. So when the FAFSA for all mandate, I shouldn't have used that word, rule came around, norm came around, it prompted a discussion about career readiness and post-secondary life readiness that prompted a whole bunch of programming for kids with developmental disabilities who now were going to complete a FAFSA. And by the way, that is so important, and I didn't say it. English learners, kids with disabilities, and I'm talking about profound disabilities, those kids complete a FAFSA. because they too need a option to attend a post-secondary experience. So I think it doesn't create the culture shift. It creates a platform off of which the culture shift can happen. And I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done, not so well in different communities. In terms of the question that oh, I'm sorry, Charity, you were going to ask the question, but I also saw your question in the chat.
It's fine if you already read it. I'm just curious within schools who you think is shouldering most of the burden that kind of falls disproportionately on counselors.
Well, I should have answered this question from Michael, because one of my unexpected things is how this policy relates to counselors. What I expected from counselors was a sort of like wholesale concern, and I was pretty close with the Counselors Association in Louisiana, that, from the unions, that this was just another work requirement that was unfairly being put on them. And I don't say that to be cynical, I say just to be real. They're taxed, they're overburdened, they're staffed. And so that's not what I got at all. The first meeting I had with the head of the Counselor Association, and literally every single meeting we had afterward about this policy, they were the first ones on board, because it, to them, dignified and kind of gave purpose to a job that they felt like district leaders were often misusing and abusing. Meaning they felt like they had been turned into test administrators, different transactional or logistical sort of people who never really got to spend time on counseling kids or post-secondary counseling. And all of a sudden they'd been given this official role to achieve a state mandate that was all about post-secondary counseling. So on one hand, they actually said, I have so many hours in a day, and you've just given me a purposeful mandate to spend a lot of those hours on this burden. So it was a burden, but it was in many ways a welcome burden, because it gave them a reason to say, hey guys, I can't just spend out time sorting test forms all day. On the flip side, if you just look at the sheer amount of hours to do it, no counselor could ever do it for their portfolio of students. And meaning no individual counselor could sit with 400 families and fill out their FAFSAs over the course of 3 or 4 months. So it can't just be counselors. You have to incent structures that bring community-based organizations, tax preparers, high school teachers, and other administrators into the mix. And one of the nice things about these FAFSA nights is you could have 500 parents show up. If you had a laptop for all of them, you could have rotating faculty trained to walk through. You bring the community college and the university counselors into the high school, by the way, to shoulder some of that burden. So you have to find ways of not doing it. Last thing I would say about this, unknown or little known, the federal government made a really important shift toward the end of the Obama administration to bump the FAFSA submission date up from February 1 to October 1, which allowed a much earlier and longer window for completing the FAFSA in a given year, which also made a lot of this much more tenable from an implementation perspective.
Thanks.
John, just one more quick question. Buried in one of your responses, you mentioned that a parallel or supporting activity was tracking whether students were on track to graduate to minimize any negative impact of the policy. Can you say more about how that was implemented? And if it implicated any kind of data tracking tools?
Yes, great question. Any school in the country can sign up with the Department of Education to receive a weekly dispatch as to who has received their FAFSA, who's completed their FAFSA, who started it, and who's completed it. Second, the states can do that for all of the districts and can then adjust what we did is to adjust and target our supports to schools that seemed like they weren't on track and where we didn't see the needle moving in terms of FAFSA completion. And that, as I said, took the form in some respects of Title I school improvement activities. In other words, I could tell you who the 50 lowest performing schools were, and we then established a full year of school improvement work with them centered around FAFSA. But also, even a week before the deadline, I could tell you, we had people on the ground with principals saying, these 5 kids haven't completed. What are we going to do to, and so we were able to deploy our people or have the higher ed system deploy their people to do it. And everybody's got an incentive to have to get kids across the finish line. The only negative in all of that, and it's worth noting, if you look at Tennessee and Louisiana's not the volume of completions. We moderately outperformed them. But if you look at the timing, their timing is earlier than ours is. And so what does that say? It says to me that their FAFSA submissions are more voluntary or sort of incentives oriented, whereas a larger share of ours were mandated or, kind of requirements oriented. And that's not a good thing. Tennessee has a much more robust community college scholarship system than we do. And, they have free community college for any citizen or community member, excuse me. So that creates an incentive early on to sign up. Whereas ours, to some degree, is, you have to do this. And to some extent, there are stragglers who are made to do it at the end. And I don't think that's nearly, obviously, as authentic a form of thinking about college as theirs is for those kids. So I think there's trade-offs in both approaches, but I wish that we had the same level of support for going to college or going to training programs that Tennessee has.
So we're fastly approaching our end time. I didn't know if there were any additional questions that anyone had. So with that, if there are no more questions, I'd like to do two things. First, John, I would really like to thank you for carving out time in your schedule to meet with us. As you know, this work is very important to us here in New Jersey. And we were really delighted to have you come and give us lessons learned. And allow us to think about how we can move this project forward here in this state of New Jersey. So really want to thank you for that. And lastly, I want to turn it over to Charles. Charles, I didn't know if you had any closing either questions and or comments to close us out for today.
Yes, I do. Several, in fact, more than we have time for. John, that was just an excellent presentation. Useful at many levels, but just to mention two, I think you have helped me refocus, helped me realize that to some degree we've done the city a disservice, those of us who have been talking about FAFSA, by focusing over much on FAFSA as access to college, as opposed to FAFSA as access to post-secondary life. I think we have been doing the former, and we should at least talk among ourselves about the need for some kind of a pivot to emphasize some of the latter. Secondly, some of us are studying Melissa Roderick's work in many ways, many aspects of her work, I should say. And you reminded me that, she's pretty blunt. Senior year in this country is a waste, senior year of high school is a waste of time and needs to be reconsidered from the beginning. So I'm glad to have that thought put back on my mind too. I'll come back to FAFSA in a second. But before that, I want to go off script for a minute and ask you I think it's a non-FAFSA related question. So far as I know, you can go right back to Reconstruction, the years after Civil War. Louisiana has almost always been at the bottom on most educational metrics, right across the 20th century, right? If I have the figures right, the last 10 years, Louisiana has either been the state that's shown the most growth on national assessment of educational process, or it's very close to that, right? It has been one of the fastest improving states on one of the toughest metrics to move at scale. So I want to know, what is your sense of what's happened, right? Why this sudden and dramatic improvement in quality? What was done right there? But also, I'd like you to say anything you want to say about what you thought were some of the mistakes that were made in the work.
Yeah, thank you. And Charles, it's very humbling to hear those questions from you, because as I've tried to express to you in the last several weeks, I'm such an admirer and have learned so much from your work, many about what we should be doing and many about what we've gotten wrong. So thank you. I don't know that there is kind of one thing I can point to in Louisiana, but I think there are two reasons why you've seen the consistency of improvement. In other words, what I've liked about our NAEP results is that there are small kind of modulations from year to year, cycle to cycle, but the general trend over a decade has been up. So to put some numbers to that, we are in the top 10 improvement in all 4 NAEP categories over the last decade. We're the highest improved in 8th grade mathematics in the last cycle, but we're top 10 improvement in every one of those categories. And so then you have to ask, in 4th and 8th grade, in reading and in mathematics, what is it that unifies our strategy? And I think what unified our strategy, I know what unified our strategy, is that we engaged in what curriculum-based reform rather than standards-based reform. And why do I draw that distinction as an important one? Well, first, I would say that the standards-based reform movement that started in the 80s and 90s, as important and profound as it was, I think kind of left the game at halftime and focused on standards, tests, and accountability systems, and didn't follow through on the full promise of standards-based reform, which was to focus on curriculum, knowledge, and professional learning. And it's not to say that the standards, the tests, and the accountability systems are easy to get, but they are basically motivational reforms, whereas curriculum is a substance and learning and cognitive reform. And Louisiana is really the only state in the country, it is the only state in the country, where you can walk into a given elementary or middle school and expect basically to see one of two curricula at work, carefully chosen by the state and districts as the highest quality, and at work in rural communities and urban communities, in predominantly white communities, predominantly Black communities. It is, and in that way, curriculum has been a much greater actual equalizer for us than have standards, which are really just words on a page, or tests, which are really very poor substitutes for curriculum in terms of shaping what actually happens in a classroom every day. So I hope that it has been our deep focus on curricula in mathematics, in reading, in social studies, and in science that has informed those gains over time. Incidentally, it certainly hasn't been population change. And some of the states that you see at the top of the list are more geared toward population change. Louisiana has experienced, and Mississippi too, and Alabama to a degree, remarkably stagnant population growth and population changes over the course of the last forever. I mean, it is just a very, very stagnant state. Its population largely hasn't changed. And so, something is going moderately right. It is worth noting that Louisiana schools are still deplorably low in the performance and the opportunity that they offer the young people of that state, and that this is multi-generational work that should never stop. And I remain deeply, deeply concerned about the state of schools in Louisiana. In terms of what was done right and wrong, I'm going to put aside the sort of urban school wars piece of it and continue to focus a little bit more on statewide policy. Just personally, I'm a secondary reading and literature teacher. My work and our team's work went immediately toward what I would call the knowledge building aspects of social studies and reading curriculum, meaning we started our focus most explicitly on middle grades reading, which is where we saw our lowest performance. I think that was a mistake. I think I had taken for granted that the non-tested grades there was a know-how there as to what schools were doing to teach the foundations of reading that was actually not happening. And that as positive as some of our fourth grade results were, they could be much, much better had we originally, I'm talking going back to 2011, 2012, brought the same focus and rigor to early grades reading that we brought to later grades reading. And for as much of a crime as the fact that we graduate so many millions of kids in this country without a next step, that's an obvious gap in the system. There is just as profound, if not more profound, a gap that we have a federal law that evaluates schools and districts based on tests that don't cover the three most important grades within the school system, which are kindergarten, first and second grade. So there's all this talk about accountability 3 through 11. There's all this talk about a high quality pre-K or childcare experience for kids. There is no talk about K 1 and 2 in this country. There's just no talk about it. And when you really talk to K 1 and 2 teachers, primary grade teachers, my experience is, for as much expertise as is out there, as many wonderful teachers as there are in that grade, they have been the ones that are most left in the cold by the current policy environment. They're given the least direction. There's the least focus on consistent implementation. And the irony of it is, the tragic irony, that is the grade where the science and the pedagogy is most essential. It is the most clinical in nature work within public schools. And if I had to do it all over again, Charles, I would have directed much more of our energy early on than I did later on, which is when we actually ended up getting around to it. So I hope that is an adequate explanation.
I mean, it's a more than adequate explanation. And you'll be interested to know that I believe Newark is both embarking on some curricular reform that's similar to what you did in Louisiana and putting great emphasis at least on early grades literacy. Well, actually, it's early grade literacy and math. I just haven't seen as much of the math work yet. So that's something that you'll want to follow. The last thing I just want to say is for the audience, just be reminded that NCLC will be leading the kickoff of this year's Newark FAFSA Challenge. I'm pretty sure the official kickoff dates will be next week. I know it's early November. There will be events all over the city. There will be all kinds of volunteer activities, including a need for volunteers to help people, to learn how to help people fill out the FAFSA. Chanel, is there anything you wanted to say now? I know you'll be sending out information later on. Is Chanel still here?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Yeah, so as Charles mentioned, we will be doing our first virtual FAFSA completion events next week. We've had a lot of interest from students, so there are quite a few students who do need help completing their FAFSA or their New Jersey Alternative Financial Aid application, which is for New Jersey Dreamers, undocumented students in the state. They do qualify for state aid. So if you're interested in becoming a volunteer, we definitely are still looking for volunteers. And we can send around some additional information about volunteer training.
And so I think if it's all, I'll send it back to Michael to say anything in closing. John, I just want to say one more time, it was a great talk. It was substantive and provocative, and so we will be building on it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Charles.
So again, I just want to reiterate what y'all said. It's a conversation that's going to continue to spark conversations internally here at the Cornwall Center, as well as throughout the city of New Jersey, Newark, in the state of New Jersey for that matter. So again, thanks so much, John. I would just like to remind the audience that we will continue to have our virtual professional development sessions. We have scheduled for November 12th, and we will be getting information out to everyone. And we also are really proud to announce a partnership with the Department of Urban Ed, where they would be doing some additional PD brown bag type virtual sessions. So we'll be getting information out to everyone, and just ask that you be on the lookout for that. And want to thank everyone for your participation today, and ask that everyone remain safe.